The Japanese didn't think the Americans could do this, not because it was difficult, but because it didn't make sense. In early 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, the United States wasn't just at war, it was on the defensive in a way the country had never experienced before. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were advancing with alarming speed, taking control of key territories, dominating sea routes, and building what looked like an unstoppable chain of victories. The Philippines were collapsing, Guam had fallen, Wake Island was gone. Everywhere the Americans looked, they were losing ground. And slowly, a dangerous idea began to take shape, not just in military circles, but in the minds of ordinary people. Maybe Japan couldn't be stopped. Maybe they couldn't even be reached. And that perception was more dangerous than any fleet or weapon, because in war, perception shapes decisions, and decisions shape outcomes.
The United States didn't just need a military response, it needed a psychological one. It needed to prove something, not just to Japan, but to itself, that the war wasn't already decided, that distance wasn't protection, that the enemy wasn't untouchable. But there was a problem. Japan was too far away, too well defended, too deeply embedded within a perimeter of control that stretched across the Pacific. There were no nearby bases, no safe staging grounds, no conventional strategy that could deliver a direct strike without massive risk. Any traditional approach would take time the United States didn't feel it had. So the question became something far more uncomfortable. What do you do when the only way to hit your enemy is to attempt something that should not work? The idea, when it first appeared, sounded almost reckless. Launch bombers from an aircraft carrier. At the time, it was considered close to impossible. Medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell were not designed for carrier operations. They were too heavy, too long, too dependent on runway distance. They lacked the structural design, the braking systems, the handling characteristics required for naval aviation. Even seasoned officers dismissed the concept. And yet, the idea refused to disappear, because it solved the one problem no one else could: reach. If you couldn't bring a runway closer to Japan, maybe you could bring the bombers instead. But solving one problem only exposed another. Even if the planes could take off, they wouldn't be able to land back on the carrier. There simply wasn't enough space, and the aircraft weren't equipped for it. That meant the mission would not include a return. The bombers would have to continue flying after the strike, pushing far beyond their operational limits, aiming for airfields in China that were barely prepared to receive them. Fuel calculations were tight even under ideal conditions. Any deviation, weather, timing, enemy detection, would turn a difficult mission into a fatal one. And so, before the mission even began, its outcome was already partially written. Some of those planes would not make it. Some of those men would not return. And still, 80 men volunteered. Not because they were certain of success, but because they understood what failure would mean. They trained in secrecy, isolated from the rest of the military, repeating short takeoffs over and over again. Every attempt pushed the aircraft to its limits. Every adjustment, weight distribution, engine timing, flap control, was studied, tested, refined. They weren't just training to fly, they were training to survive something that had never been attempted before. There was no manual for this, no proven method, just theory, pressure, and instinct. If they made a mistake, even a small one, the aircraft wouldn't lift. It would plunge into the ocean within seconds, and everyone involved knew that. On April 2, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers were secured onto the deck of the USS Hornet. It was an image that defied logic. Large land-based bombers sitting on a naval carrier, surrounded by open ocean, preparing for a mission no one had ever seen before. The task force moved west across the Pacific in silence, escorted and protected, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The plan depended on surprise. It depended on getting close enough to give the bombers a fighting chance to reach their targets, and maybe, just maybe, reach safety afterward.
Every mile brought them closer to success and closer to exposure. Then, the plan broke.
Hundreds of miles earlier than expected, a Japanese patrol vessel spotted the fleet. A single moment, brief, distant, but enough to compromise everything. If that sighting was reported, Japan would be ready. The element of surprise would disappear. The mission would collapse before it even began. The commanders aboard the carrier faced a decision that mirrored the kind of pressure the pilots would soon experience. Turn back, preserve the fleet, and abandon the mission, or launch immediately, knowing that doing so would push the bombers beyond their designed range. They chose to launch.
And with that decision, the mission transformed. It was no longer just dangerous, it became desperate. The extra distance meant that fuel margins, already thin, were now almost non-existent. The crews understood the implication immediately. This wasn't just a risk anymore. It was a near certainty. Reaching China would be unlikely. Survival would depend on luck as much as skill. One by one, the bombers prepared for takeoff. The carrier deck rose and fell beneath them as waves rolled through the Pacific. Wind, speed, timing, everything had to align perfectly. The first aircraft moved forward, engines roaring at full power, accelerating toward the edge of a runway that was far too short for a plane of that size. For a split second, it seemed impossible. Then, just at the edge, the aircraft lifted into the air. One after another, all 16 bombers followed. Against every expectation, every doubt, every calculation that said it couldn't be done, it worked.
Hours later, they reached Japan, cities that had never been attacked before, targets that had been considered safe by distance alone. The bombers flew low, minimizing exposure, navigating through unfamiliar terrain, releasing their bombs over Tokyo and other strategic locations. The explosions were real, but the damage was limited. That had never been the objective. The true impact was psychological. For the first time, the Japanese homeland had been struck. For the first time, the illusion of safety had been broken. But the mission was far from over. Now came the part that no one could fully prepare for: the escape. Fuel gauges were dropping faster than expected. The early launch had taken its toll. The pilots pushed forward into the night, flying blind over unfamiliar territory, hoping to reach Chinese airfields that were barely operational. Some crews held on until the last possible moment before bailing out into darkness. Others crash-landed. Some were captured. A few would never make it home. And the consequences extended far beyond the mission itself. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces carried out brutal reprisals in regions of China suspected of aiding the American crews. Entire communities were targeted. Civilians were killed on a massive scale. It remains one of the darkest and least discussed consequences of the raid, an outcome that reveals the true complexity of war, where even success carries a cost that cannot be measured in military terms alone. And yet, despite everything, the losses, the limited physical destruction, the uncertainty, the mission succeeded in a way that could not be measured by damage reports. It changed perception. Until that moment, Japan believed distance protected them, that control of the Pacific created a shield, that their homeland was beyond reach. The raid shattered that belief, and in doing so, it forced a reaction, a strategic shift driven not by strength, but by fear. Japan moved to expand its defensive perimeter, to eliminate what it saw as growing threats before they could strike again. That decision led directly to a confrontation just months later, a battle Japan believed it could win. They were wrong. That battle was Midway, and it would become one of the most decisive turning points of the war in the Pacific. For the United States, the Doolittle Raid was never about destruction, it was about momentum. At a moment when the country needed proof that the war was still winnable, it delivered something even more powerful than victory: belief.
Belief that the enemy could be reached, that strategy could overcome distance, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, initiative could change the direction of history. The men who flew that mission understood the risks from the beginning. They knew the odds. They knew that many of them would not return, but they went anyway. Not because they were fearless, but because they understood what was at stake if no one did. The Japanese didn't think the Americans could do this, and for a brief moment, that belief became their greatest mistake. Because sometimes the most dangerous move in war is the one your enemy believes is impossible.